I never thought quiet could be so loud. It was the kind of evening where you could hear the wind rattling against the window frames, each gust threatening to push its way in. But inside our house, it was the stillness that pressed against me. The kids were asleep upstairs, their laughter and chaos tucked away for the night. The only sound in the dimly lit kitchen was the slow ticking of the clock above the sink, steady, indifferent, and far too rhythmic for the chaos creeping into my life. I'd come home earlier than usual. My boss had called off the final meeting, leaving me with a rare free evening. I thought I'd surprise my wife, Dana. Maybe we'd cook dinner together for once, something we hadn't done in months, not since life had begun swallowing us whole. Between the kids, her book club, and my long hours at work, the distance between us had grown like ivy, slowly suffocating whatever warmth we once had. I parked the car in the driveway and noticed that the porch light was on, glowing softly, as if welcoming me home. Stepping inside, I found the house unusually quiet. Dana wasn't in the kitchen, not lounging in the living room like she often did this time of night with her laptop open and a glass of red wine resting on the coffee table. I figured she was upstairs, reading or maybe scrolling through her phone. That was the habit these days, both of us stuck in our corners of the house, scrolling through other people's lives while ours quietly fell apart. I set my briefcase down by the door, loosened my tie, and headed toward the stairs. I was halfway up when I heard her voice. It wasn't loud, not the kind of conversation you'd expect when someone thought they were alone. It was hushed, like a secret carried on a whisper, the kind of tone you use when you don't want to be heard. I froze, one hand gripping the wooden banister, my body leaning just enough to hear the faint echoes of her words. It was instinct, not curiosity, that kept me there listening. I knew the weight of that voice without needing to understand the words. Something was off. Something dark had been planted in the cracks of my marriage, and I had just stumbled upon it. "I miss you too," she said softly, her voice barely traveling down the hallway. "But you know how it is. He's always home late, and tonight was supposed to be the same." I couldn't breathe. My chest felt like it was being crushed by something invisible, something familiar, yet horrifying. The way she said it, casual, almost bored, was like hearing a knife sharpened slowly against stone. I could picture her sitting on our bed, her legs folded beneath her, one hand clutching her phone as she whispered sweet words to someone who wasn't me. "Next week," she continued. "He's got that business trip. I'll have more time then." The room tilted. My fingers tightened around the banister as I tried to keep myself steady. A business trip. She had been keeping track of my schedule. Not because she cared, but because it gave her opportunities. The thought hit me like a slap to the face. My mind raced, but I didn't dare make a sound. Not yet. The voice on the other end of the line, his voice, was too muffled for me to make out the words, but I could hear the faint hum of it, the comforting sound of someone she trusted. I didn't need to hear him to know the truth. Whoever it was, they had taken up space in her life, in the place I once occupied. And then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife deeper, she laughed. Not the polite chuckle she gave strangers at a party or the forced laugh she used during awkward family dinners. This was the laugh I hadn't heard in years, the kind that once belonged to us when we were young and foolishly in love. Hearing it now, meant for someone else, felt like a betrayal far worse than anything physical. "I have to go," she said suddenly, her voice dropping even lower. He could be home any minute. Panic shot through me. I knew if she hung up and came out of the bedroom, she'd see me standing there like a fool, my world unraveling at my feet. I backed away, careful not to make a sound as I descended the stairs. My heart thudded against my ribcage, each beat threatening to give me away. Back in the kitchen, I grabbed my briefcase and walked out the front door. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to move, to put distance between me and the truth I had overheard. The cool night air hit me like a bucket of ice water, but it wasn't enough to wash away the heat of my anger. Dana was cheating on me. I didn't know who the man on the other end of the phone was, but that didn't matter. What mattered was the woman I had trusted, the mother of my children, the person I had built a life with, was making plans with someone else while I played the fool downstairs. I walked down the street, my mind racing with questions I wasn't ready to answer. How long had this been going on? Who was he? A coworker? A friend? Someone I knew? It didn't matter. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that the wife I thought I knew was someone else entirely, and tonight was the night I had to face that truth. I stopped under the dim glow of a street lamp, breathing heavily, my thoughts colliding like a car crash. There was no going back now. I couldn't unhear her words, couldn't pretend this was a misunderstanding. The distance between us wasn't just emotional anymore. It was real, and it was growing by the second. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I cared enough to close it. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I sat in the car for hours, parked at the far end of our street where the glow of the house couldn't reach me. The dashboard clock blinked uselessly in front of me, the minutes dragging like an old wound reopening. I wasn't sure what I was waiting for, maybe for the light in our bedroom to go out, or maybe for a sign that would tell me how to act when I stepped back through that door. But there was no sign, only silence. The same suffocating quiet that had become a familiar part of my marriage. It had snuck up on me, I realized, like a slow leak in a boat. At first, you ignore the creaks and groans, but eventually, the water rises, and by the time you notice, you're already sinking. By the time I finally went home, dawn was breaking. The neighborhood was still asleep, and the world felt eerily peaceful, as if mocking the chaos inside me. I quietly unlocked the door, careful not to wake the kids or Dana. Not that she'd hear me. She was probably fast asleep, dreaming of someone else. The thought made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to push it aside. I climbed the stairs slowly, avoiding the creaky spots out of habit. When I reached our bedroom, I paused. The door was slightly ajar, and inside, Dana lay curled up beneath the covers, her hair spilling over the pillow like nothing had changed. I stood there for a moment, staring at her, trying to remember the last time I had looked at her like this. Not with suspicion or anger, but with love. I couldn't. Without a sound, I slipped into the guest room and shut the door behind me. The bed was cold and unfamiliar, but it didn't matter. I didn't plan on staying long. The next morning, I acted normal. I didn't confront her over breakfast or accuse her while she was packing the kids' lunches. I figured I needed time to think, to piece everything together before I made my move. As much as I hated the idea, I had to be smart about this. Dana was in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone when I finally walked in. She looked up and smiled, a warm, practiced smile that had fooled me for years. "You were up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." "Work stuff," I lied. My voice was steady, rehearsed. I knew if I showed any sign of what I knew, she'd get defensive. That was the thing about Dana. She could smell a shift in mood like a predator sensing fear. And right now, I needed her to think I was oblivious. She nodded and returned to her phone, her fingers tapping away at some message or another. I wondered if it was him. Was she telling him about last night? Was she laughing at me, thinking I was too blind to see what was happening under my own roof? The bitterness burned like acid in my throat, but I swallowed it down. Not yet. Later that afternoon, I found myself searching for clues. I wasn't proud of it, but I had to know. I waited until Dana took the kids to a play date, then went back upstairs to our bedroom. My hand was shaking as I opened her nightstand drawer, digging through the clutter, books, receipts, and random knickknacks that meant nothing to me. But buried beneath it all was her phone charger, neatly coiled like a snake waiting to strike. I didn't find anything in her messages. She was too careful for that. But when I opened her photo gallery, my breath hitched. There weren't any explicit photos or anything obvious, but there were pictures, casual shots of family gatherings where I recognized nearly every face except one. A man. He wasn't front and center, just lingering in the background like a ghost in the corner of a photograph. He looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place him. Then, as I scrolled through more pictures, it hit me. He was a distant relative. One of those cousins you only see at weddings or funerals, someone you barely remember until they're standing right in front of you. His name escaped me, but his face was burned in my memory now. I remembered him from last year's family reunion, the one Dana had insisted we attend even though I had been reluctant. He'd been friendly, charming even. I had thought nothing of it at the time. But now, seeing his face over and over again in the background of photos I didn't even know existed, I realized just how wrong I'd been. When Dana came home that evening, I watched her closely. She was cheerful, humming as she unpacked groceries and asked the kids about their play date. It was sickening how easily she played the role of the perfect wife and mother, as if the secret she was carrying didn't weigh her down at all. I didn't confront her. Not yet. I needed her to think she was safe, that I was none the wiser. But inside, I was already planning my exit, already picturing the moment when I'd finally shatter the illusion she had created. The cracks were already there, and it was only a matter of time before the whole thing collapsed. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just sit quietly in the corner. It spreads, infecting every memory, every shared moment, until you're left questioning whether any of it was ever real. By the time Dana and I sat down for dinner that evening, the cracks in my mind were widening, but I stayed composed. I watched her pass the mashed potatoes to our son, her smile lighting up the room like nothing was wrong. It was a performance, and she was the star. "Did you get that proposal finished?" she asked me, her tone casual. Her fork hovered over her plate, waiting for me to answer like she actually cared. "Almost," I replied, cutting into my steak with slow precision. "Long day at the office." She nodded, and for a moment, everything felt normal, too normal. But beneath the surface, I could feel her hiding something, like an actor forgetting their lines, but bluffing through the scene anyway. I studied the way her fingers drummed lightly against the table, the way she avoided eye contact for just a second too long. By the time the kids had finished their dinner and run off to watch TV, I knew I couldn't wait much longer. The weight of what I had overheard, what I had seen in those photos, was pressing down on me like a storm cloud about to burst. But I needed one more confirmation, one more slip-up to seal the truth before I confronted her. That night, while Dana showered, I went back to her phone. I knew the passcode by heart. It was the same one she had been using for years, a combination of our wedding date and her favorite number. It was ironic, really. The life we had built together was now the key to unlocking her betrayal. I scrolled through her recent call logs, searching for anything out of place. Most of the names were familiar: friends, family, the kids' school. But then, buried near the bottom, I saw it. An outgoing call to a number with no name attached, just a string of digits that meant nothing to me. I copied the number down and shoved her phone back where I had found it, just as the bathroom door creaked open. Dana stepped into the bedroom, wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping water onto the carpet. She looked at me and smiled, oblivious to the fact that her secret was unraveling piece by piece. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." She nodded, not pressing further, and disappeared into the closet to change. I stared at the bedroom ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Who was he to her? How long had this been going on? And why him? A distant relative, a man we barely saw outside of family gatherings. What made him worth risking everything we had built? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew where to start. The next morning, I made an excuse to leave the house early. Dana barely noticed. She was too busy packing the kids' lunches and texting someone on her phone, probably him. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. In my car, I dialed the number I had copied from her call log. It rang twice before a male voice answered. "Hello." I froze for a moment, caught off guard by how ordinary he sounded. There was no hint of guilt, no hesitation, just the casual tone of a man who had no idea his life was about to get complicated. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. Instead, I hung up and stared at the phone in my hand, my heart pounding. It was him. I didn't need to hear his name to know. The familiarity in his voice was enough to confirm what I had already suspected. I drove aimlessly for a while, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The anger was there, bubbling beneath the surface, but so was something else, something cold and final. I wasn't going to confront him. Not yet. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of knowing he had gotten under my skin. But Dana? She was about to learn just how far she had pushed me. When I returned home that evening, I found her in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, but did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside me. I stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment, wondering how she could act so normal when everything between us was falling apart. "You're home early," she said without turning around. "Yeah," I replied, my voice steady. "Figured I'd help with dinner." She glanced over her shoulder, surprised but pleased. "That's rare," she teased. I forced a laugh, the sound hollow in my ears. "I guess I'm full of surprises today." She smiled and handed me a knife. "Here, you can dice the tomatoes." As I chopped, my mind raced through everything I wanted to say, every accusation that was clawing at the back of my throat. But I knew I couldn't drop it all at once. She'd deny it, twist the narrative, make me out to be paranoid. No, I needed her to confess on her own. As we sat down to dinner, I looked across the table at her, my appetite long gone. "I ran into someone today," I said casually, keeping my gaze locked on hers. "Oh," she said, spearing a piece of chicken with her fork. "Who?" "Your cousin," I replied, watching for any flicker of recognition in her eyes. "The one from the family reunion last year." Her hand froze midair for just a second before she recovered. "Oh, really? That's random. What did he say?" "Not much," I said, leaning back in my chair. We didn't talk long. Her eyes darted away, just for a moment, but it was enough. She was hiding something, and she knew I was circling closer. "I've been thinking," I continued, my tone still casual. "We should do something as a family. Maybe another trip. It's been a while since we spent quality time together." "That's a good idea," she said, her voice a little too quick, a little too eager to change the subject. I nodded, masking my anger beneath a neutral expression. "Yeah, we'll talk more about it soon." But I wasn't planning a trip. I was planning her downfall. I waited 3 more days. Each one felt like walking on broken glass, knowing what I knew, but forcing myself to act normal. It wasn't easy, especially when Dana went about her daily routine like she hadn't shattered the foundation of our marriage. She still kissed me goodbye before heading out, still asked about my day over dinner, and still lay beside me at night as if the man she whispered to wasn't slipping through the cracks of our home. But I had learned something important during those 3 days. She was growing nervous. It was in the way her eyes lingered on me a second too long when she thought I wasn't paying attention, the way her fingers fidgeted with her phone whenever I walked into the room. She knew something was coming, but she didn't know when. I wanted her off balance. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done before I dropped the final blow. It was on the 3rd night that everything fell apart. We were in the living room, the kids upstairs, the TV playing some forgettable crime drama neither of us was paying attention to. Dana sat on the couch, scrolling through her phone, while I pretended to be interested in the show. My heart was racing, but my face remained neutral. "I ran into your cousin again today," I said suddenly, breaking the silence. Dana's fingers paused mid-scroll. "Really? That's twice in 1 week. What a coincidence." "Yeah," I said, turning to look at her. "Funny how that happens." She didn't look up. "Did he say anything interesting?" "No, elite." But it got me thinking, when was the last time we saw him? The family reunion, right? She nodded, her fingers resuming their tapping against the screen. "Yeah, I think so." I leaned back into the couch, letting the weight of the moment settle between us. "You ever talk to him outside of family events?" The question hit her like a slap. Her fingers stopped moving, and she finally looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if she were trying to gauge how much I knew. "Not really," she said, her voice a little too casual. "Why do you ask?" I shrugged. "Just curious. He seemed familiar, like you two might have stayed in touch." Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she caught herself. "Nope, just family reunions and things like that. Nothing else." Liar. I could feel the anger rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. Not yet. I wasn't done. I stood up, stretching like I was ready to head upstairs for the night. "I'm going to grab some water," I said, walking toward the kitchen. "You want anything?" "No, I'm good," she replied, already looking back at her phone. I turned the corner, but instead of heading to the kitchen, I waited just out of sight. My pulse was pounding in my ears, but I forced myself to stay still. I knew her well enough to know what would come next. Less than a minute later, I heard her voice, soft, hesitant, and exactly what I had been waiting for. "I can't talk long," she whispered into the phone. "He's acting weird. I think he knows something." My grip on the wall tightened. The voice on the other end was faint, but I caught enough to understand. "You're just paranoid," he said. "He's probably just stressed from work." "No," Dana insisted. "It's more than that. He keeps bringing you up, asking questions. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up without him figuring it out." There it was, the confirmation I needed. She wasn't just cheating, she was scared. And that fear was the fuel I needed to burn whatever remained of our marriage. I stepped back into the living room, my footsteps loud enough to make her jump. She quickly hung up the phone, her face pale as she tried to compose herself. "Who were you talking to?" I asked, my voice calm, almost curious. "Nobody," she said too quickly, slipping her phone in her pocket. "Just a friend." "A friend," I repeated, nodding slowly. "The same friend you've been sneaking around with? The one you were just whispering to about how you think I know?" Her face went white, and for the first time in days, she had nothing to say. No excuses, no lies, just silence. I took a step closer, the air between us crackling with tension. "You thought I wouldn't find out, didn't you?" I said, my voice low but steady. "You thought you could sneak around behind my back, and I'd be too blind to see it." "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think." I snapped, my patience unraveling. "I heard you on the phone. I saw the pictures. You've been lying to me, Dana. Don't you dare stand there and pretend otherwise." Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't soften me. If anything, they fueled my anger. She wasn't crying because she was sorry. She was crying because she had been caught. She started, but I cut her off. "How long?" I demanded. "How long have you been seeing him?" She shook her head, the tears spilling over as she backed away from me. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It just—" "Spare me the excuses," I said, my voice like steel. "You destroyed this marriage. You, not me." She sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands as sobs racked her body. I watched her for a moment, waiting for the anger to subside, but it didn't. All I could feel was the weight of the betrayal pressing down on me, suffocating whatever love I had left for her. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red and swollen. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I'll end it. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." I shook my head, the final thread snapping inside me. "There's nothing to fix, Dana. You already broke it." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. I turned and walked away, leaving her in the living room to cry over the mess she had made. I didn't sleep that night, but this time it wasn't from uncertainty. The anger that had burned in my chest had given way to something colder, finality. There was no coming back from this. No fixing what had been shattered. As I lay in the guest room, listening to the muffled sound of Dana's crying from down the hall, I realized that whatever love I had for her had faded the moment she confessed. By morning, the house was eerily quiet. The kids had already left for school, and the absence of their usual chaos made everything feel hollow. I stepped into the kitchen, expecting Dana to be there, but it was empty. A plate of toast sat untouched on the counter, and the coffee maker hummed softly, the pot half full. I poured myself a cup and sat at the table, waiting. I knew she'd come down eventually. Sure enough, after a few minutes, I heard her footsteps on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale, eyes puffy from a night of crying. She was still wearing the clothes from the night before, and for a moment, she looked like a ghost of the woman I had once loved. "Morning," she said quietly, as if afraid to speak any louder. I didn't respond. I sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch between us until she shifted uncomfortably. "We need to talk," she said finally, her voice cracking. I set my mug down and leaned back in the chair. "Go ahead." She hesitated, wringing her hands like she was trying to squeeze out the right words. "I know I hurt you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know what I did was wrong, but it wasn't." "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Don't try to downplay it. Don't tell me it wasn't what it seems. I heard you, Dana. I saw the pictures. I know exactly what it was." Her eyes filled with tears again, but this time I felt nothing. No sympathy, no urge to comfort her. Just the cold satisfaction of knowing she couldn't hide anymore. "It started after the reunion," she admitted, her voice trembling. "We reconnected, and, at first, It was just innocent. We were catching up, talking about family. But then it turned into something more. I finished for her, my voice bitter. She nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. I didn't mean for it to happen. I wasn't looking for it, but he... Don't blame him, I snapped. This isn't about him. He didn't force you to do anything. You made that choice. She flinched as if I had slapped her, but she didn't argue. She knew I was right. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered. I love you. I do. I don't know what happened. I made a mistake, a horrible mistake. I laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. A mistake is forgetting to pay the bills. This was a choice. Over and over again. Her sobs returned, and she sank into the chair across from me, burying her face in her hands. I watched her cry, unmoved. If this had been a year ago, maybe even a few months ago, I would have reached out to comfort her. But now, there was nothing left to give. I'll end it, she said through her sobs. I'll cut him off. I'll block his number, delete everything. Please, just give me a chance to make this right. There's no making this right, I said coldly. You can't undo what you did. But we have a family, she pleaded, lifting her tear-streaked face to meet my gaze. The kids, we owe it to them to try. The kids will be fine, I replied. They deserve better than this mess you've created. For a moment, she just stared at me, as if she couldn't believe the words coming out of my mouth. So that's it? She whispered. You're just going to throw everything away? I'm not the one who threw it away, Dana. You did. Her shoulders shook as she broke down again, but I didn't flinch. I stood up, grabbed my mug, and rinsed it in the sink. When I turned back around, she was still sitting there, crying into her hands like a child who had been scolded. I'll be staying at a hotel for a few days, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I need space to think, and honestly, I can't be here right now. She looked up, her face a mixture of panic and desperation. Please don't do this, she begged. I know I messed up, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, we can... No, I said firmly. You had your chance to fix this before it ever got to this point. Now it's too late. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving her sobbing at the table. Upstairs, I packed a small bag, throwing in just enough clothes for a few days. As I zipped it up, I thought about the life I was leaving behind, the house, the memories, the promises we had made to each other. But those promises meant nothing now. As I walked back downstairs, I heard her footsteps behind me. She stood at the bottom of the staircase, her eyes swollen and her lips trembling. Don't leave, she whispered one last time. I met her gaze, my voice steady. Goodbye, Dana. I opened the door and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. But for the first time in days, I felt something close to relief. I wasn't running away. I was walking toward something new, something that didn't include her lies. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't coming back. The hotel room wasn't much, just a plain, beige space with stiff pillows and the faint smell of industrial cleaner. But it was quiet, the kind of quiet I hadn't felt in my own home in a long time. I sat on the edge of the bed, my bag tossed carelessly on the floor, and stared out the window at the glowing city lights. Somewhere out there, life was moving forward, people were laughing, working, living without the weight of betrayal crushing them. I leaned back, letting my head rest against the wall. My phone buzzed next to me, another message from Dana. I didn't need to check it to know what it said. She had been texting me nonstop since I left the house, alternating between apologies and desperate pleas for forgiveness. I hadn't responded to any of them. The truth was, there was nothing left to say. By the second day, I had contacted a lawyer. I wasn't ready to make any decisions, but I needed to know my options. The thought of divorce was like a bitter pill lodged in my throat. But the alternative, staying with her, pretending this hadn't happened, was even worse. The lawyer's office smelled of leather and old books, the kind of place that made you feel small no matter how confident you were when you walked in. The man sitting across from me looked professional, calm, the kind of person who had seen stories like mine more times than he could count. How long has the affair been going on? He asked, his voice steady. I swallowed hard. A little over a year, I think. Maybe longer. He nodded, jotting down notes. Do you have proof? I thought of the photos, the overheard conversations, the confession Dana had sobbed out at the kitchen table. Yes. He leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. Then you have options. If you want to move forward with the divorce, we can build a case. But before we go that route, I need to ask, are you sure this is what you want? Was I sure? That question had haunted me ever since I walked out of the house. But as I sat there, surrounded by the sterile calm of the office, the answer came easily. Yes, I said firmly. I'm sure. He nodded, as if he had expected that answer. Then let's get started. That evening, I sat on the hotel bed, scrolling through the pictures on my phone. Photos of family vacations, birthday parties, random moments that had seemed so important at the time. In every picture, Dana smiled brightly, her arm wrapped around me or the kids, as if nothing could touch us. It was a lie, I realized. A carefully crafted illusion that had cracked long before I overheard that phone call. The signs had been there. I had just ignored them. The late nights, the sudden interest in family gatherings, the way she had pulled away from me without explanation. I had chalked it up to life, to stress, to the inevitable strain that came with marriage. But it wasn't life that had pulled us apart. It was her. A knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, I considered ignoring it. But the knocking continued, soft but insistent. When I opened the door, I wasn't surprised to see Dana standing there, her coat wrapped tightly around her as if it could protect her from the cold, or from me. I can't do this, she said, her voice cracking. I can't just let you walk away. I sighed, stepping aside to let her in. She stood awkwardly near the door, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for a clue about what I had been doing since I left. Why are you here, Dana? I asked, my voice tired. I need to talk to you, she said, her hands trembling. Please, just hear me out. I crossed my arms and leaned against the wall. Go ahead. She took a deep breath, tears already welling in her eyes. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I ruined everything, but I love you. I've always loved you. I made a terrible mistake, but that doesn't mean we have to throw everything away. We can fix this. No, I said, cutting her off. We can't. Her breath hitched, and she shook her head as if refusing to believe it. You don't mean that. You're just angry right now. But we could go to therapy, we can... I'm done, I said, my voice firm. You made your choice, Dana, and now I'm making mine. She sank onto the bed, her face crumpling as she sobbed into her hands. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt a strange sense of relief. Her tears didn't affect me. They didn't sway me or make me question my decision. I had given her my trust, my love, and she had thrown away. I didn't mean to lose you, she whispered through her sobs. You didn't lose me, I said coldly. You let me go the moment you started seeing him. Silence filled the room, broken only by the sound of her crying. I stood there, watching her, knowing that this was the end. She could beg, she could apologize, but it wouldn't change what she had done. The damage was too deep, the betrayal too complete. Eventually, she wiped her eyes and stood up, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Is this really what you want? She asked one last time. I nodded. Yes. She opened the door, pausing for a moment as if hoping I'd call her back. But I didn't. I watched her walk away, her footsteps echoing down the hallway until they faded into silence. When I closed the door, I felt something lift off my chest. It wasn't happiness, far from it, but it was freedom, a break from the weight I had been carrying for far too long. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to the life I had before. That chapter was over, and it was time to write a new one, without her. The hotel room felt smaller after Dana left. The air was heavy, filled with the echoes of her sobs, but I didn't let them linger in my mind for long. I sat back down on the bed, staring at the packed bag by my feet, and thought about the life that awaited me outside this room. It was a blank page, one I hadn't expected to be writing at this stage of my life, but maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. I checked my phone, scrolling past the flood of unread messages from Dana. Apologies, promises, pleas, none of them mattered now. I deleted the entire thread and blocked her number for the night. I wasn't ready to deal with her any further. I needed space, real space, where her words couldn't reach me. That night, I finally slept. It wasn't a peaceful sleep, but it was enough to keep me from drowning in my thoughts. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. The next few days blurred together. I met with the lawyer again, signed paperwork, and began the process of ending my marriage. Dana tried calling me from different numbers, sent emails, even showed up at my workplace once. But I didn't waver. Each attempt she made only solidified my decision. She wasn't fighting for me. She was fighting to preserve the image of the life she had destroyed. I moved out of the hotel and into a temporary apartment on the other side of town. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, but there was something liberating about starting over with so little. I didn't need the reminders of the past. I needed room to breathe, to rebuild. One evening, while unpacking a box of clothes, I found an old photo tucked between two folded shirts. It was from our honeymoon, Dana and I standing on a beach, the sun setting behind us, both of us smiling like the world was ours. I stared at the photo for a long time, wondering how we had gotten from that moment to this. Then, without hesitation, I ripped it in half. It wasn't an act of anger. It was closure. I placed the torn pieces in the trash and didn't look back. The divorce wasn't messy. We kept things civil for the sake of the kids, dividing assets and agreeing on custody arrangements without too much conflict. Dana cried during the meetings, but I remained composed. The time for emotions had passed. One day, after signing the final papers, Dana stopped me outside the lawyer's office. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale. "Do you really hate me now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I thought about it for a moment, searching for the truth in my own heart. "No," I said honestly. "I don't hate you, but I don't love you either. And that's worse." She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I just wish things had been different." "So do I," I replied. "But wishing doesn't change what's done." With that, I turned and walked away. Months passed, and the ache of betrayal began to fade. I focused on my kids, on rebuilding my life piece by piece. The apartment slowly transformed into a home. Not the kind filled with memories of the past, but the kind where new memories could be made. I reconnected with old friends, took up hobbies I had abandoned years ago, and found comfort in the simple things. Morning coffee, a good book, the sound of rain against the window. There were moments when the loneliness crept in, but it didn't consume me. It reminded me that I had survived worse, and I was still standing. One afternoon, while picking up the kids from school, my son asked me a question that caught me off guard. "Are you and Mom ever going to get back together?" I knelt down to his level, meeting his innocent gaze. "No, buddy," I said gently, "but that doesn't mean we don't both love you and your sister. We'll always be your parents, no matter what." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and ran off to join his sister. I watched them for a moment, a bittersweet smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. Dana and I had broken, but the kids hadn't. They were resilient, stronger than I had given them credit for. And maybe, in some strange way, that gave me hope for myself, too. One evening, as I sat on the balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't angry anymore. The bitterness, the resentment, the weight of betrayal had finally lifted. What remained was a quiet acceptance, a sense of peace that came from knowing I had done the right thing by walking away. I wasn't healed completely, and I didn't expect to be, but I was moving forward, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the future was mine to shape. As I sipped my coffee and breathed in the cool night air, I thought about that blank page waiting to be filled. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibilities. And this time, I wouldn't be writing a story of betrayal. I'd be writing one of freedom.